Every February, the best college players in America are summoned to Indianapolis. The NFL Scouting Combine is where futures are made and broken. Players are weighed, measured, timed, and tested in every way imaginable. Every drill is designed to answer one question: can this man play football at the highest level? But tucked inside the gauntlet of athletic evaluation was something that had nothing to do with athletics: a 12-minute written exam, 50 multiple choice questions covering vocabulary, basic math, and abstract reasoning. No football, no playbook installation, no route concepts. A test originally designed in 1936 to screen office clerks. The Wonderlic Personnel Test. The Supreme Court ruled in 1971 that using this test as an employment gatekeeper was discriminatory when it had no proven connection to job performance. The NFL heard that ruling and then kept using the test for another 50 years. This is the story of the Wonderlic in the NFL, how a test that predicted nothing became a weapon that cost everything. If this is your first time here, this is Old School Sundays, where we dig into the stories that shape sports history. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. To understand how the Wonderlic ended up in professional football, you have to understand what it actually is. In 1936, a psychologist named Eldon Wonderlic developed a short cognitive ability test designed for the corporate world. The idea was simple: give employers a quick way to evaluate job applicants. Could this person handle basic math? Could they follow written instructions? Could they process information under timed pressure? The test was used to hire clerks, salespeople, and warehouse managers. It was never designed to evaluate athletes. It was never designed to measure leadership, decision making under physical duress, or the ability to read a cover 2 defense. That changed in the 1970s when Dallas Cowboys head coach Tom Landry started giving the Wonderlic to draft prospects. Landry was an innovator. He helped pioneer the 4-3 defense. He studied game film obsessively, and he believed that football was becoming complex enough that teams needed to measure a player's mental capacity alongside his physical tools. The idea made sense in theory. Football is a thinking game. Quarterbacks process dozens of variables before every snap. Linebackers read formations and adjust assignments in real time. The question was never whether intelligence matters in football. The question was whether the Wonderlic was the right way to measure it. It was not. The test asked questions about vocabulary, arithmetic sequences, and geometric patterns. It asked which month of the year comes ninth. It asked you to calculate the cost of fabric by the yard. These are perfectly reasonable questions if you are hiring someone to manage a supply chain. They tell you absolutely nothing about whether a man can stand in the pocket with a blitzing linebacker bearing down on him and deliver an accurate throw to a receiver running a post route at full speed. Those are two completely different kinds of intelligence. But the NFL did not make that distinction. Based on Landry's recommendation, the league adopted the Wonderlic as a standard part of the scouting combine. And for the next 5 decades, every prospect who walked through those doors in Indianapolis sat down with a pencil and 12 minutes on the clock. The test was in, and once it was in, it was almost impossible to get out. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't know about. Before the NFL ever made the Wonderlic a standard part of its evaluation process, the test had already been at the center of one of the most important civil rights cases in American history. In the 1960s, Black workers at Duke Power Company's Dan River Steam Station in Draper, North Carolina, were confined to the lowest paying department in the plant, the labor department, janitorial work. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate based on race, Duke Power did not open its doors to Black workers. Instead, it changed the locks. The company announced that employees who wanted to transfer out of the labor department now needed either a high school diploma or passing scores on 2 standardized tests. One of those tests was the Wonderlic. On paper, the requirement looked neutral. Everyone had to meet the same standard, but the result was anything but neutral. In North Carolina at the time, only 12% of Black males had completed high school compared to 34% of white males. The testing gap was even worse. With the cutoff scores Duke Power set, 58% of white applicants passed, 6% of Black applicants did. The new rules accomplished exactly what the old rules had accomplished. Black workers stayed at the bottom. A man named Willie Griggs and 12 of his co-workers sued. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1971, the court ruled unanimously against Duke Power. The court held that employment tests do not have to be intentionally racist to be illegal. If a test disproportionately excludes a racial group, and the employer cannot prove the test is directly related to job performance, That test violates the Civil Rights Act. The Wonderlic was the test in that case. Not a similar test, not a comparable test. The Wonderlic itself. The court made it plain. If you are going to use a test to determine someone's employment, that test better measure the actual job, not intelligence in the abstract, the job. The NFL began making the Wonderlic mandatory at the combine just a few years later. The league took a test that the Supreme Court had just flagged as discriminatory in a hiring context and made it the most consequential hiring process in professional sports. And nobody stopped them. So the obvious question becomes, did the Wonderlic at least work? Did it predict which players would succeed in the NFL? The research is clear. It didn't. Multiple academic studies over the years have examined the relationship between Wonderlic scores and professional football performance. The results are consistent. There is no statistically significant correlation between a player's Wonderlic score and his success on the field. A study by Brian Lyons and colleagues examined over 700 NFL players across 3 draft classes and found that general mental ability as measured by the Wonderlic was unrelated to future NFL performance, unrelated to draft selection decisions, and unrelated to the number of games a player started. A separate pair of studies actually found a slight negative correlation at certain points, meaning that in some cases, lower scores were a better predictor of success than higher scores. The anecdotal evidence tells the same story. Dan Marino scored a 15 on the Wonderlic. He's in the Hall of Fame. Terry Bradshaw scored low. He won 4 Super Bowls. Donovan McNabb scored a 14. He was a 6-time Pro Bowl selection and led the Eagles to 4 consecutive NFC Championship games. On the other end, the only player in history to score a perfect 50 was Pat McInally, a punter for the Cincinnati Bengals. Ryan Fitzpatrick, a Harvard graduate, scored a 48. He played for 9 different teams and 17 seasons without ever winning a playoff game. High scores did not make great players. Low scores didn't make bad ones. The test measured something, it just did not measure football. But here's where it gets worse. The test may not have predicted performance, but it absolutely affected draft position. A study published in the Yukon Law Review examined quarterback Wonderlic scores from 1999 to 2006 and found that players who scored 1 standard deviation above the mean were drafted on average at pick 108. Players who scored 1 standard deviation below were drafted at pick 136. That is a difference of almost a full round. And in the NFL, draft position determines your rookie contract. The difference in average annual salary between those 2 draft slots in 2008 was nearly $70,000. Now, layer the racial data on top of that. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Sports Economics found that black draft picks average a score of 19.76 on the Wonderlic. White draft picks averaged 27.7. That is a gap of nearly 8 points. Black quarterbacks specifically scored on average 7.75 points lower than their white counterparts. The 12 lowest scores in Wonderlic history all belong to black players. And researchers found that teams rewarded white prospects nearly 15 draft spots higher for a strong Wonderlic score, compared to just 6 spots for black players with the same improvement. So the test did not predict who would be good at football, but it did predict who would get paid less. And the players getting paid less were disproportionately black. The NFL insisted that Wonderlic scores were confidential. Commissioner Roger Goodell sent a memo to all 32 teams in 2012 reminding them that scores were not to be shared publicly. The league burned test results onto DVDs and sent them by Federal Express to each franchise to prevent leaks. On paper, the system was airtight. In reality, scores leaked every single year, like clockwork. And the leaks were not random. They followed a pattern. The players whose score made headlines were overwhelmingly black. The players who had to answer questions about their intelligence at press conferences before they had ever played a professional down were overwhelmingly black. When a white player scored high, it was treated as a fun piece of trivia. Did you know Ryan Fitzpatrick went to Harvard and scored a 48? When a black player scored low, it became a referendum on his ability to think. No case illustrates this more clearly than Vince Young. In January 2006, Young had just delivered one of the most spectacular performances in college football history, leading Texas to a national championship with 467 total yards against USC. He was considered a top 3 pick. Then the combine happened. On February 25, 2006, reports surfaced that Young had scored a 6 on the Wonderlic, a 6 out of 50. The story spread instantly. ESPN covered it. Talk radio ran with it. Jim Rome went on air and said he would not trust a man who scored a 6 to cross the street without getting hit by a bus, let alone run an NFL offense. There was one problem: the score was wrong. The test had been graded incorrectly. Young's actual score was a 16, still below the quarterback average, but not the intellectual catastrophe the media had portrayed. His college coach, Mac Brown, called NFL officials directly and confirmed the error. An NFL spokesman later acknowledged that the reported score was inaccurate, but the correction did not travel at the same speed as the lie. By the time the truth came out, the narrative had already been written. Vince Young, the man who had just orchestrated one of the greatest victories in college football history, had been publicly framed as someone too unintelligent to play quarterback in the NFL. Some analysts speculated he might fall out of the top 10 entirely. His agent was blamed for not preparing him with practice tests. Nobody blamed the system that leaked an incorrect score and then used it publicly to humiliate a 20-year-old black man weeks before the most important moment of his professional life. Young was eventually drafted third overall by the Tennessee Titans. He won Rookie of the Year. He made two Pro Bowls. But the Wonderlic story followed him for his entire career. Every time he struggled, every time there was a question about his command of the playbook or his decision making, the number 6 was waiting in the background. A wrong number from a test that predicted nothing, leaked by a system that was supposed to protect him. In 2022, the NFL quietly announced that it would no longer administer the Wonderlic test at the scouting combine. Troy Vincent called it an outdated process. No press conference, no apology. No acknowledgement of the decades of damage, just a memo and a pivot. But even the removal came with a catch. The NFL stopped giving the Wonderlic at the combine, but individual teams are still free to administer it during private visits and pre draft workouts. The test is not banned, it's just no longer official. The league washed its hands publicly while leaving the back door wide open. The Combine replaced the Wonderlic with newer evaluations like the S2 cognition test, which measures split-second decision-making and reaction speed, the kind of intelligence that actually matters on a football field. But the old habits resurfaced immediately. In 2023, S2 scores for the top quarterback prospects leaked before the draft. CJ Stroud was reported to have scored an 18 out of 100. Bryce Young reportedly scored a 98. The media ran the same playbook it had run for decades. The co founder of S2 Cognition went public and said at least two of the leaked scores were inaccurate. A new test, the same leaks, the same narratives, the same players being questioned. And the Wonderlic was not the only tool the NFL used to measure black players against a different standard. In 2021, it was revealed that the league had been using race norming in its concussion settlement program. When retired players filed claims for brain injuries sustained during their careers, the NFL assumed black players started with lower baseline cognitive function. Black players had to demonstrate more severe decline to qualify for the same payouts as white players. The league eventually removed the practice, but the fact that it existed at all tells you everything about how this league viewed the intelligence of its black players. The Wonderlic was never about finding smart football players. If it were, the NFL would have abandoned it the moment the research showed it predicted nothing. They would have abandoned it when the Supreme Court ruled that using it as an employment filter was discriminatory. They would have abandoned it when incorrect scores were leaked and used to publicly humiliate prospects before they ever took a professional snap. But they didn't abandon it. For 50 years, the NFL clung to a test that measured vocabulary and arithmetic and called it football intelligence. A test where the racial scoring gap was nearly 8 points. A test where the 12 lowest scores in history all belonged to black players. A test where the scores were supposed to be confidential, but somehow only became public when they could be used to damage a young man's reputation and his earning potential. The Wonderlic was not a measure of intelligence. It was a measure of control, a way to impose a standard that had nothing to do with the game and everything to do with who got to be seen as worthy of playing it. In a league that is roughly 70% black, the intelligence test they chose just happened to be the one that penalized black men the most. And when the evidence piled up that the test was useless, the league kept it anyway. That was never a mistake, that was a choice. Thank you for watching Old School Sundays. If this story hit different, Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And remember, the history they do not teach you is usually the history that matters the most. Peace.